There are proposed amendments related to signs, and so we're back to you today to finish up one of those last remaining items, and these are the actual ordinance revisions to Municipal Code Chapter 2270. Just a little bit of background. The city first adopted sign regulations in 1888, and we've had various amendments since then, but we haven't had a major revision to the sign ordinance since 1984. And I wanted to highlight the intent of the sign regulations. This is an excerpt from the beginning of the ordinance because I think it highlights what the city intended when it adopted sign regulations. And one thing is that we adopted the policy that the sign should serve primarily to identify an establishment and that they should not subject the citizens of the city to excessive competition for their visual attention. And at the beginning of the sign ordinance, there's a lot of language that really speaks to the aesthetic qualities that the city has, and we believe that it's partially these sign regulations that we have that help add to that visual aesthetic. Municipal Code Chapter 2270, which is the sign regulations, has essentially three categories of signs, and these are the three I'll be speaking to today. We have exempt signs, which make them exempt from sign regulations and the need to get a sign permit. I'll walk through some of those. We have a section called prohibited signs, and then those signs that are subject to review per adopted standards in the ordinance, and I'll be speaking to some of those throughout the presentation. So the purpose of today's discussion is to bring to you some amendments that staff and the sign committee primarily have been working on as we found challenges with enforcing certain provisions of the sign ordinance. Also, we've had some new technology introduced with respect to signs and new advertising techniques that have emerged since the last major revision, so we'd like to add and revise some definitions in the regulations to address those. We also want to clarify some areas that have been confusing for businesses and the public and staff. And so you'll see some areas where we want to revise certain provisions that we think will help assist enforcement efforts, and also for businesses and the general public to understand how sign regulations may or may not apply to them. So the first category of signs are exempt signs, and currently the ordinance has 24 types of signs that are exempt from regulation if you meet certain criteria. Those are signs that are required by governments, temporary construction signs, temporary for sale signs, your address on your house, temporary open house signs, official flags, temporary window signs that people might display advertising a sale at a business, and garage sale signs. So these are just some examples of the 24 types of exempt signs. I'd like to highlight just those areas in the exempt sign ordinance where we're proposing changes, and I'll go through and show you some examples of some of these. Here's essentially the list of those exempt signs where we're proposing some type of change, and that is temporary holiday signs. We want to make it clear that any holiday sign and associated lighting should be treated the same. We also have proposed to allow 2 temporary balloons for each business. We're proposing to increase the size of for lease and for sale signs that are allowed to be exempt. Also to allow 1 neon or LED open sign per business. We want to make it explicitly clear that temporary window signs are not to be illuminated. We would propose that we allow up to 5 off-site open house signs on public property in compliance with standards. We want to clarify signage related to gasoline pumps and limit flags that are exempt from the regulations to just 2 flags per parcel. So now here's some specific examples. This is an example of temporary holiday sign and lighting. We just want to make it clear right now the ordinance exempts temporary holiday signs. We often see lighting associated with those signs, and we just want to make it clear that when the time is up to remove your holiday sign, that you also remove your holiday lighting, and that's supposed to be 10 days after the event. With respect to balloons, they're currently prohibited in the city, and right now we use a section of the ordinance that prohibits signs that rotate, move, and glare. We don't have a definition of a balloon in the ordinance right now. We don't have an explicit prohibition, but we have for many years used that section of the ordinance to prohibit balloons. So one change we want to do is add a definition of balloon. And then also for your discussion today, if you want to consider allowing balloons, we've proposed language that would allow 2 balloons in a temporary nature at each business. And temporary in this context would mean that it couldn't be up for more than 10 consecutive days and a total of no more than 60 days per year. And this is just proposed language. I think we've heard from some people in the community who don't have a strong feeling towards prohibiting balloons. Others do, and so I'd be interested to hear what the public has to say. I could tell you from a staff's perspective, it's difficult to enforce anything that has a temporary nature to it, because it's difficult for us to know how long something has been up unless we're at the site every day, and it's just really not feasible for us to do that. For sale and for lease signs are currently exempt if they meet certain size requirements, and in residential zones right now that size is limited to 3 square feet, and also they can be no taller than 6 feet above the ground. We're proposing a change to allow these signs in residential zones to increase to 4 square feet. So to allow for a little bit more enhanced visibility, since there is a limitation on the height. And just an example here, this is one that would be prohibited. It looks like it's at the top of the building. It's clearly over 6 feet. This could be in compliance if it's under 6 feet in that example. Neon or LED open signs. We currently allow 1.5 square foot sign area at each entrance to a building that identifies the address of the building, the hours and days of operation, whether or not the business is open or closed, but it does not currently allow an illuminated sign like this. But with new technology, we have begun seeing these more and more at businesses. I'm sure you've seen them, and they are not currently allowed. We did go to the sign committee in 2008, and they developed some guidelines for us to allow 1 neon sign at each business if it met certain size criteria. And that criteria is a maximum letter height of 6 inches and a maximum overall sign height of 12 inches. And so since 2008, we've been using that guideline when we've gotten complaints about open signs, and we've allowed those to remain if they've met that criteria. We also recently went back to the committee and asked if LED signs were okay, because we did get a request from some businesses that wanted to allow those, and it is found acceptable as long as they aren't flashing or changing color, because that's still a prohibited type of sign. So these are just 2 examples around town that are acceptable. This one here is actually too large. The font type is too high to meet that 6-inch maximum. Currently, the ordinance allows one on-site open house sign to advertise that the house is open for viewing, and 3 off-site open house signs, and they all must be located on private property as the ordinance is currently written. However, there's a longstanding practice of realtors in the community to place these on street corners to direct people to the house, and we think that's it can be acceptable if they're placed in locations that don't impede pedestrian traffic down the sidewalk or impair motorists from seeing oncoming traffic or other people. And so we've been working with the Association of Realtors to develop some guidelines for if we are to allow these temporary open house signs on public property, that we make sure they're put in safe areas and that we allow up to 5 of them to be off-site, so increasing it from right now you can have 3. We'd be proposing to allow up to 5 if they're placed in compliance with these standards that's being proposed in the ordinance. With respect to gas pump signage, right now a gasoline pump is referenced in a section of the ordinance for exempt signs, along with telephone booths and newspaper racks, and it really just states that you're allowed to have lettering on these machines or equipment to explain how they function. And it's confusing because it doesn't really say any more than that. And so we're proposing to remove the reference to gasoline pump from this particular exemption category because it's actually redundant with another section of the ordinance that allows people to display signage that's required by law. And so there are some code sections that require gasoline stations to advertise the type of gas, the price of gas, and certain other requirements. And so we think it would reduce confusion if we just allow that exemption to guide what signage a gasoline station could have. And also clarify that any signage that isn't required by law would be subject to the overall maximum square footage of sign that a gasoline station could have. So in this example, we've got extra signage here that should be counting towards the overall square footage allowed on the property as well as here, whereas all this lettering and signage here is most likely required by law and would remain exempt and not count towards that square footage. So it's not a change in practice, it's really just clarifying in the ordinance how sign square footage relates to gasoline stations. With flags right now, they're exempt. If you're celebrating a national holiday, you can fly a flag. Also, you can have it up for a temporary basis to celebrate a holiday. You can also have permanent flags displayed on your property. We're proposing that each parcel, in order to qualify for that exemption, fly no more than 2 flags on their property. And we also want to clarify, because it isn't clear now, that if a corporation were to fly flags like this or this, that it would need to count towards the overall square footage of signage allowed on the property. It's not in addition to any other signs they have. Okay, this next section of signs I'd like to discuss is prohibited signs. Currently, there's 24 types of signs in the ordinance that are designated as prohibited. And here's a list of some of those examples. Signs attached to utility poles. I've mentioned the signs that rotate, move, or glare that we've used to prohibit balloons in some cases. Portable signs, mobile signs, banners, pennants, and signs containing changeable copy are also prohibited. We're not making too many changes in the prohibited signs section. We're mostly clarifying and adding some definitions at the beginning of the section to help clarify the existing regulations. These are some examples of prohibited signs. This is a portable sign. It's currently prohibited by the ordinance. Same with the banners. The inflatable signs, we have used that same section that prohibits anything that rotates or moves to prohibit those, but we do want to add a definition of inflatable sign and expressly prohibit these as well. So that is a change with respect to those. And then this particular sign would be prohibited because it's located in the public right-of-way. You will hear from realtors today, and I think you did receive a letter from the Association of Realtors, their desire to allow for sale signs in the public right-of-way. And staff really has concerns with that request, and our recommendation would be that we continue to prohibit all signs in the public right-of-way, except for the temporary open house signs, which I briefly discussed, if they're placed consistently with adopted standards. I think I've covered most of these. The proposed changes we are making to prohibited signs would be to allow open house signs. We want to explicitly prohibit changeable lighted message signs, and we would do that by adding a specific definition of what that is, and it's also listed in that section of the ordinance that prohibits changeable copy and other signs that rotate or move or flash. We talked about inflatable signs, and then we also want to clarify that banners, of course, are prohibited, but we also have had some challenges with enforcing banners when they're hung in an open bay, and so we'd like to add a definition of an open bay sign, and here's some examples of those cases where you have a banner here in this case, and it's clearly prohibited. It's displayed outside, and same in this case here. Where we've run into issues in the past is that when we use another section of the ordinance to try to enforce banners, we have a definition of a window sign that essentially allows us to regulate the first 4 feet beyond a window, and we've used that section of the ordinance for guidance in trying to enforce on signs that are displayed in these open bays. But as you can see in this example, it's really difficult, and it really doesn't accomplish much from an enforcement perspective, where this banner is actually hung 4 feet back from the face of the open bay, and so in today's ordinance that would be allowed. What we'd like to propose is a definition of an open bay that gives us a little bit more leeway in stating that an open bay sign is one that's hung in a manner that's designed to be viewed from adjoining streets, walkways, malls, or parking lots available for public use through an open bay or another opening within a structure. So in this case, you have an automotive repair bay, a warehouse bay, even an open courtyard or patio. And this, I think, would really help clarify the enforcement process and make it clear that in some of these cases, a matter of 0 to 4 feet setback from the open bay doesn't really have a big effect when you're the person walking by and seeing some of these signs that are intended to be prohibited in the city. Just some general requirements and definitions that we're proposing to amend is the definition of a sign. What I have here is essentially the current definition of a sign with the changes highlighted in orange here. We'd like to add to the definition of a sign projection of light, video display, or open flame. And I'll show you some examples of those. And this is really to respond to new technology that we're seeing and new advertising techniques. We'd like to add a definition of illuminated sign, and that includes the projection of light onto another surface. And I'll show you an example here in a moment of what type of sign that is. As I mentioned before, we'd like to add definitions of balloon and inflatable signs so that we can expressly regulate those by themselves and not try to cover them under an existing section of the ordinance. We'd also like to amend the definition of a window sign, and this particular section can be challenging because right now the definition of a window sign is any sign that's either attached to a window or placed even 4 feet behind the window. And so we have that the ability to regulate signs hung 4 feet behind a window, But where we've had issues with that is when these signs become illuminated, or they're neon signs, or they're somehow illuminated, and then those signs set back 4 feet, really, it doesn't give you enough distance to have that visual separation. It's the same intensity as though it was right there in front of the window. And so we'd like to add to the definition of a window sign that our regulations would extend 10 feet behind the window if the sign's illuminated. And I'll show you an example of that. And we also would like to add a definition of changeable lighted message sign to just specifically respond to some signs that we've seen where we've regulated them under that section of the ordinance that prohibits signs that rotate and change and move. And this, we just want to have an explicit definition for it. This is an example of video display, which we would like to add to the definition of a sign. In these two cases, these are displayed on gasoline pumps and here in a storefront. And you can see they're meant to attract attention like any other sign would. And so we're proposing to add that to the definition of sign so that it falls under the sign regulations. Currently, these video display signs are prohibited by the ordinance, again, by that section that prohibits signs that move or change. So we're seeking your input as to whether these signs should remain prohibited, along with all those other signs that change and move and rotate. And we think you'll hear from speakers who have differing opinions on this, and so we'd like your input on that. And I think staff's preference would be that we keep them under a prohibited sign like all other signs that change or move out of fairness, because it'd be difficult to enforce and I think justify allowing some signs to move and some not. So if they're going to be allowed, how would we distinguish which ones should be allowed or not? If they are allowed, then we'd like to make it clear that this area of the display would count towards the overall signage allowed for the business, and it'd be subject to the sign regulations. These are examples of illuminated signs. We'd like to add a definition for them and also make it clear that if you display this type of sign, it counts towards your overall square footage allowed for your business. And this window sign example shows what our current definition would allow and not allow. So in this case here, there's a banner strung outside the business. It's prohibited. Our current definition of a window sign states that we regulate the first 4 feet back from the window. So in this example, they set it back 4 feet and it's allowed. And we're not actually proposing any change to that at this point. However, in this case, because these are illuminated, I don't know exactly how far back these signs are, but you can see that even if they're 4 feet back, they're still very visible from the street, and that's why we're proposing that illuminated window signs like this have be set back at least 10 feet in order to be exempt. Otherwise, they'd be subject to regulations and would need sign committee review. Okay, there's a certain section of the sign ordinance that speaks to signs in El Pueblo Viejo, and I just want to highlight one change we're proposing to make there. It has to do with lighting around windows or lighting that you can see from the outside, because as you're aware, any exterior change in El Pueblo Viejo requires HLC review. And although these lights can be displayed inside, they really give the effect in the same visual effect to the outside. And so we're proposing that any of these lighting techniques be unacceptable in the sign ordinance if they're located within 10 feet from the window. So again, we're trying to have more regulation on those signs that are illuminated within the first 10 feet of the window, as they can have the same visual effect as if they're displayed outside or if they're displayed right up against the glass. So in summary, the The proposed amendments have been generated primarily by staff in the sign committee over the last several years. We do have support from the HLC and the ABR on these proposed amendments, and I believe you received a letter from the HLC to that effect. Again, primarily we just want to clarify the regulations so that it's clearer for businesses and the general public and staff to know whether they apply to them and for us to enforce them. And we also want to update the code to respond to new technology, add new definitions, revise definitions where necessary so that we have a current code that reflects the types of signs that we're seeing today. So we ask for your recommendation to council for adoption of the proposed changes. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. We also have Joanne LeConte here who can help answer questions.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So that's the end of the staff's presentation? Yes? Okay. So questions for staff before we open up to public comment? Mr. Hotchkiss? No. I have a question about the, because you mentioned it, but it wasn't within the changes that are being recommended. The sandwich board type signs or menus that you see on the front of restaurants in town. I didn't see that. There's no change to that at this point in terms of our recommended ordinance, or is there?
Councilmember House, there is a section of the ordinance that exempts, I'm just looking for it, exempts menus if they meet certain criteria, but the sandwich board sign you mentioned is a portable sign, and that's prohibited. We're not planning to make any changes to that. So if someone's menu happens to be on a portable sign, it would remain prohibited. But there are provisions to allow a small menu display outside a business within a certain size and letter height.
I see.
Intended to be on the wall.
At some point, and it probably isn't today, but I'd very much like to hear more about the portable kind of, you call them portable signs, but the kind that you see, the little sandwich board type signs you see outside of restaurants typically, to understand better what the concern is about that, because I've never quite gotten it. I can imagine oversized signs, ones that become really huge, or maybe if somebody's walking around with one. But just the ones that are more diminutive and the ones right by the entrance to restaurants, I haven't yet. It hasn't come across. Maybe somebody who's here from the public who's on one of our boards or commissions could help me understand what the real concern is about that. And it's not really on our agenda today, but it's one of those things that I've tended to think didn't need to be so heavily restricted. Maybe restricted certainly in terms of size or design, or have to go through design review. But anyway, just something for conversation. Yes, a question from Mr. Hotchkiss.
In enforcement on something like that, what happens?
Councilmember Hotchkiss, with respect to portable signs, if we receive a complaint about a portable sign, we'll go out and verify if we see the sign ourselves, document it, and then usually we require removal of that within 3 days because it's fairly easy to abate.
So you send them a letter or give them a call? Or?
Yes, or if we talk to them in person, we just verbally tell them, but we usually try to follow up in writing just so we have the documentation.
And if that doesn't work, is there a dollar amount that's leveled?
There is. If they miss abatement deadlines, the first fine is $100 per sign.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're going to open public comment in just a moment. We had, at the last meetings where we were discussing this, we covered quite a bit of ground already, having to do with the expiration of approvals and time extensions, the definition of projects, and we really had a lot of different kinds of things we've covered, ZIR, timing, but we're now talking about these particular sign regulations and changes. I also had a request to speak last time, which I had made a special arrangement for because we really weren't going to get through the meeting last time if we had taken this up. And this was Jonathan King. Jonathan, you had asked for some additional time for a presentation, and I had said that would be okay this time. How much time will you be needing? You have some others that have signed up and given time to you, but how much time do you need? I'll need you on the mic if you would, please, real quickly. Just go up here.
Chairman, we need about 10 minutes for the presentation, and then there are some other speakers.
Well, does that include those who are giving time to Mr. Fell, or is this separate?
That's separate.
Okay, so I only
But they're
have,
separate.
right now I only have 2 speakers who have, or let me just see here, yourself and one other who has offered some time to you. Let me be sure if I have this. Pumpflix, is that separate or is it the same?
It's the same. Pumpflix is the
Okay,
same.
so Mr. Hager is here. Okay, and I think that's it. For Pumpflix, is there anyone else?
There were several that were here last week, and you agreed their time would be able to be.
Staff, you can help me with this, would you please? I want to make sure that we've got that allowed.
That's
Yes,
correct.
that's right.
They have,
Thank you for reminding
the
me.
carryover from last meeting was 12 minutes of speaker slips.
Okay, thank you
including
for
the
reminding me.
individuals who are here
Okay,
today.
when I call on you, we'll work within that time frame. Thank you. And I'm not calling on you yet. We'll start with Natalie Cope.
Chair.
And yes,
May I
please.
interrupt for a second? We have some commissioners who would like to
Mm-hmm.
speak to the item, and we were wondering if they could go first because of conflict with another
Let's see.
meeting.
And I have Natalie, Cope, Alex Peugeot, Stella Larson from the Planning Commission. Is there anyone else? Yes, okay, Mr. Cunningham. All right, very good. Anyone else? All right, then we're going to start right away with Natalie. Sure. Okay, Mr. Peugeot.
Dear Councilman House and Hotchkiss, I need to attend another meeting representing the city for the 101 corridor, where we always look for sign conflicts as well. I've been a member of the sign committee since 1988, so I've been involved with this in good times and bad. And these issues usually come during when economic conditions are down. There's a lot of pressure to do more, to advertise more, and I would like to issue a word of caution. I know my friends in the real estate business are hurting, and I am hurting too. But I'm not sure if the number of signs will move a property. You know, so there's always an interest in do more, but these regulations are changed, and they're changed forever, in good times and bad. I would like to mention. First of all, the introduction that staff made about the purpose of signage as identifying an entrance, a business, an entrance. If you're looking for a business, you find it, and the sign points to the pedestrian entrance or the driveways, and it's a driving facility. It is not to promote, meaning to promote the business or to advertise a business. So that's very important, because you see things that are sometimes the rules are changed, and the location of the sign is very important. Speaking on behalf of the Pueblo Viejo, of the Landmarks Commission, and we are really concerned about the use of lighted signs and the LED displays in EPV. Specifically on the gas stations, and the issue of noise and unwanted information being blasted that does change the character of the district, so we're concerned about that. So that's really all I want to say. I'm going to leave my time for the others. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Then Natalie Cope, followed by Bob Cunningham. And
Good afternoon. I just wanted to say I'm definitely in support of what's been proposed here today. A lot of these examples and changes and clarifications have come through the sign committee with respect to many of the issues that have come up before us, and we want to make sure that we're fair and equal to the public. So we have actually been imposing many of these things that are sort of gray areas at the moment with these clarifications to try to be consistent. So I really do appreciate that we're seeing these coming through the ordinance change, and I hope they are approved. With clarification for the sandwich boards that you mentioned before,
Yes,
the
ma'am.
portable signs.
Yes, thanks.
I just wanted to mention many times those boards are located in public right-of-way, and I think a lot of the times the reason they have been removed is because they become a hazard with someone maybe tripping over them in the public right-of-way. So that is one reason why it's been enforced.
Mm-hmm.
So
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for helping with that. Okay, we'll have Bob Cunningham, followed by Stella Larson.
Mr. Chair, Mr.
Yes.
Hotchkiss, thanks for allowing me to speak. I don't have a whole lot to add. I'm also a member of the sign committee and have served 3 terms for a total of 8 years. And I wanted to just say that I'm in support of the changes that are being presented. I do have some concern regarding flags, and I'm hopeful that if we do end up allowing the flags, that they go through a suitable permitting process, and we don't end up with some what now constitute pole signs and movable signs. That concerns me. I'd like to state that while I am in sympathy with everybody who's suffering because of the economy, I agree with Alex that additional advertising is not necessarily and probably isn't going to generate more business, because the business simply isn't there. We will get to better times, but making changes now in response to people's concerns about not getting enough business because they don't have enough exposure is probably a slippery slope that we will not be able to climb back up. We make changes now. When the economy gets good, I doubt whether we're all going to be coming back saying we don't need all these signs, let's remove them. Please just remember the spirit of our ordinance and the spirit of this place. This is a very special town. Without the ordinances that we have, and not just the sign ordinance, but all of the others that keep this place beautiful, we will be like every other town in California, and there will be less reason to come and visit here, and there will be less reason to want to live here. And again, one more thing on the signs in the right-of-way. It's I think important to advertise open houses. That is to me critical to the sale of a house. But I think that we need to be careful how we use the public right-of-way. This applies also to sandwich board signs. Remember what the sidewalk is for. It's a place where people need to get from one place to another, and dodging signs is not easy, and I suspect that it would result in liability issues for the city as well. Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry I missed the first meeting. I was
glad you were here.
indisposed.
Thank you for coming. Okay, very good. We'll go Commissioner Larson, and then Jonathan, you'll be next.
Thank you, Mr. House. Greetings, Mr. Hotchkiss. I apologize for not being on the first round either. I do want to start out by saying something I remember Doug Bartoli said to me many, many years ago. He's passed on now, but he stood at State Street and he looked down at the balloons and we were out. I was learning how to do sign busting from him, or sign enforcement, make a list and list violations, and he said, "Look at this. If this were music, we'd be deaf." And I thought, I get it. It's a cacophony that we're creating of vision. And so as signs are developed and media changes, we're subjected to more and more and more means of advertising, audio, LED, projected lights. In my business in interior design, it's called a gobo, where you walk into a building and maybe it says welcome and it's beamed down from above, or in a hotel lobby if you're going to have a conference and you're welcoming the AMA or something like that, you can have a gobo made and have that beamed down, welcome AMA. That's not new technology for interiors, although projections of it are new for exteriors. So you'll start to see that. In Los Angeles, you see tons of that, and you can just see it by driving the 405. So it's not that the signs aren't necessary, it's the proliferation in a small space. We don't have a large city. We have a small city, really, and if we pack it up with a lot of signs, it's going to be tremendously cluttering. I do appreciate the clarifications of the definitions of signs. I do want it to include signs that people carry, because when you go to North San Diego County, you see people twirling signs now on all the corners for housing tracts, for restaurants, and I've seen it here too, starting here. So I don't want to leave that out. I'm glad that that we are clarifying balloons and inflatables because we know what that looks like over time with lots of helium fueled things over Oxnard and Ventura. You see those constantly with flags fluttering from the strings and things like that. On the display of the flag, I would suggest that whenever an applicant comes in and wants to display the flag, they be given the rules for displaying the flag, lighting at night or not flying in inclement weather, and to take care of the flag, not just put it up to attract people. The lack of ability to enforce should not be the criteria for easing sign regulation. I mean, it's true we have problems right now with enforcement. There's no question about that. But because you can't enforce it doesn't mean it shouldn't be. So I don't think that that is a valid argument for opening up the sign ordinance. I think with GPS and Google Maps and everything we have available, I think that thanks, I see you counting the time. I think that 5 signs is more than plenty for any realtor. 3, I'm still in support of 3 signs for open house. And I think gasoline stations, the noise is the noise. And they're already noisy. And to add more to that is, I think, a mistake. And I think that's just about got it. I support what Mr. Peugeot has said and also what Mr. Cunningham has said as well. So thank you for your time.
Very good.
And
Thank you very much. And thanks for coming. Appreciate your input. Okay, we're going to go to Jonathan King, who has a presentation, I think, representing Pumpflix. And I've put the 12 minutes up here, and you can use as little of that as you'd like.
All right. And Mr. Chairman, may I ask that Joe Armendariz be able to speak first because he has to leave?
Yes, by all means. Mr. Armendariz, you're listed here.
Thank you, Grant. Plus, I'm not part of the presentation for Pumpflix. I wanted to speak to the Ordinance Committee on the issue in general. First of all, of course signage works. Signage is advertising. If you don't believe that, then I'd encourage both of you to not use signs when you run for your next office. I mean, we all know that signage is important, and it would seem to me rather ridiculous for us in the middle of the worst recession ever to be putting additional restrictions on businesses' ability to communicate with their customers and with potential customers. As we all, I think you were there, Grant, yesterday at the Chamber of Commerce Economic Development meeting where, you know, again, somebody got up and talked about the problem of dealing with the city with respect to his particular sign. And I think the spirit, the zeitgeist of this particular era right now in Santa Barbara and the region really should be what can local government be doing to form strategic partnerships with businesses to help them become more dynamic, more successful, more effective, and more profitable. Because ultimately that's going to generate more revenue and more economic vitality, and that's going to allow those of us in elective office and government to deliver the core programs and services that our constituents not only pay for, but frankly, that they're entitled to. With respect to Pumpflix, I would challenge the premise that this is a sign. I would offer instead that this is really a medium. It's a medium of communication. And in fact, it's not just a medium of communication to benefit one particular company or interest. It's a medium of communication that is being shown very effectively to bridge the divide between the private sector and the public sector, and indeed even the nonprofit sector. If you look at the content that is on these Pumpflix TVs, you're seeing a lot of government information, the ability to offer information about national emergencies, local preparedness. This is important stuff. This is stuff that local government benefits from. It also provides a way for the nonprofit community to communicate with local residents, local voters, local taxpayers, and the like. So I would just argue that this is not the time to be making it more difficult to do business. This is not the time to be putting additional restrictions on local companies to be profitable. That, in fact, it's the time to be doing exactly the opposite.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, Ms. King, let's go ahead and get your things started here. Mr. Fell, you'll be following hers, and we have, for your presentation, we had 2 people, Mr. Lindeman and Mr. Price, who had both offered their times to you. They're both here in the audience.
Thank you for your time, Councilman House and Councilman Hotchkiss. We are dealing with a little technical difficulty. We had hoped to be able to run this from my computer. At this point, we're running from the official
Do
computer.
you want to wait
so
a minute while it's worked out, or are you ready to go?
They weren't able to work it out. It seems to be a faulty cord.
Okay.
So I have given you both a presentation, and we will run it from here, and I'll just guide as we go through. So basically, we're here to give a presentation of what Pumflix is and what it is not. And it is our belief that a lot of the issues around the signage concerns today are about signage that attracts people into a business, as opposed to what Mr. Armendariz was referring to in terms of it being a channel, a medium for communication, and a medium for messaging that does a lot of good in the community. So if we could move to the second. Basically, Pumflix is a Santa Barbara-based digital media company, and they have LCD displays located above the local gas pumps. As you can see, this has actually been around for 20 years. This is an earlier form of that medium. This is today's version, and if you look closely at the photo on the left, you can see that you really can't see anything. In fact, even staff's photos last time showed that it looks pretty blank. It looks pretty dark from the street. It's not designed to bring people in to the business. It is there to communicate with them while they are pumping gas. And we are also looking at even a mute button that would allow them to turn off the sound while they're pumping gas if they want to do that. Basically, Pumflix serves local businesses, local nonprofits, the city of Santa Barbara, the county of Santa Barbara, and our community. I do have a demonstration on my computer. I don't know that you will be able to see it today because of this technical difficulty, but we currently have messaging going on from everybody from the Scholarship Foundation of Santa Barbara to the Santa Barbara City Airport, or Santa Barbara Airport, to emergency preparedness and a lot of other things, along with advertisements for local businesses. Pumflix offers a great medium for boosting awareness about these businesses, about these nonprofit programs, about other community programs. It also provides a great medium for local tips and information, so everything from emergency preparedness, as I mentioned, to other kinds of announcements that the city and the county and others may need to make to reach your local constituency. It is also able to integrate with local news, weather, traffic, and public service announcements and other community information. It will be offering live traffic updates starting this month, updated every 4 to 5 minutes. When accessed through the loop, so that's actually a service to the community and to drivers around. They'll know how much traffic is on the freeway, how much traffic is around the area. And we are in the process of building the capability to be a channel for emergency operations communications before and during a disaster, so to help prepare the community for a disaster and everything from clearing brush to whatever else they may need to hear. In addition to during a period of emergency, you can move to the next slide, we will be able to have the Emergency Operations Center take over the screens at each of these stations, and there are approximately 8 screens per station, again directly on the pump, not within, and certainly inside the 4-foot radius that you would require for an indoor business. Gas stations are an outdoor business, but it's definitely inside that radius. And so the Emergency Operations Center will be able to take over those screens and communicate with, they'll become congregation areas where people can come and find out what's safe, what's not, where do they need to go, who needs to evacuate when, etc. The way it works is through these videos with audio tracks, still images as well, free public service announcements, RSS news feeds, and what I've already discussed. Pumflix is very carefully controlled and monitored. So as I said, it's located well inside, not at the edge of the gas station properties. It is visual, but it's seen when you're pumping gas. It's audible, it's heard when you're pumping gas, but as I mentioned, we're looking into and discussing installing a mute button, so if the customer doesn't want to hear it while they're pumping gas, they can turn off the sound. The sound automatically drops every night at 7 p.m., 20 to 30 decibels, and that's as the traffic noise drops. We don't have any neighborhood complaints. Distinctions from other city signage concerns. Pumflix is not trying to attract people to the gas station's business, which was the main objection to all other signage shown by city staff. Pumpflix is simply providing personal viewing devices with information for its customers. And Pumpflix content cannot be seen, at least in the daytime, from the street. City staff photos taken from an estimated 10 feet away from the screens showed blank screens. These are significant differences from all other signage shown by city staff. These are a few of the advertisers and beneficiaries. You can see that the Santa Barbara Airport has been a beneficiary. The city of Santa Barbara has been a beneficiary. Santa Barbara Family YMCA, several businesses in town, the city of Goleta, the Santa Barbara Airport. It is a channel for communicating a variety of messages, whether they be for economic purposes, driving people into the businesses, or whether they be to communicate something about a public service program, a public awareness program, and emergencies. It's been in the news, as you know, and you'll probably see it in the news again. And as I said, we did have a demonstration. I don't think we can show it without this cord working that connects, but you would see each of those, many of those public service announcements and advertisements if you were able to see it, both in the form of videos as well as stills. Okay?
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you. So then we go to Mr. Fell. And Mr. Fell, you have 6 minutes if you need it.
Chair House, I'm from Mr. Hotchkiss. I won't say the Ordinance Committee because there's just two of you today. My name is Doug Fell, and I represent Mr. Price, who's the owner of Seaside Shell and other gas stations, and is the owner of Pumpflix. Before I address the main issue, and this is really quite interesting because I was studying this ordinance so carefully to understand what was going on, I came across something, and I'd ask you to turn to page 7 of attachment 1 of the staff report and look at SS. You'll see a definition for vending machines. And it says, a vending machine is a machine or other mechanical device or container that dispenses a product or service through a self-service method of payment. Now, any of us that has purchased gas lately knows at least we don't use cash anymore. We use our credit cards, and that's how we're buying our gas at the gas station. And therefore, it is a vending machine. And it fits that definition, and it's not excluded. And then if you go to a separate part of the ordinance, which is section 2270.095, which I put up, it's not in your packet, I put it up there on your desk. It's this little two-piece thing here. You'll find that vending machines that are readily visible to the public are prohibited in any of our landmark districts. So that means all 3 of the gas stations on Correa Street would have to close down. I think there's a simple way to solve this, and it isn't huge, but it needs to be solved, and that is by amending the definition of vending machines to exclude gasoline pumps from the definition, because today they are, and they're going to be more and more so. But the primary reason I'm here today isn't to talk about this issue. It's just that it came up, and then I said, holy cow, I've got a client who's got a gas station that is subject to being closed down. What we're here is to talk about gas pumps and Netflix and whether they should be treated as a sign and regulated under the sign ordinance, and whether we can have Pumpflix on gas pumps. Gas pumps are a necessary necessity. We need them. We've got to have them, or we can't get around. I mean, yes, we're going to encourage bikes and we're going to encourage people to walk on sidewalks, but when it all comes down to it, we still got to go to the gas station if we're going to go anywhere significant. Can't get from your house to City Hall easily without a car, although some of you have ridden your bike. And I think, Grant, you have, haven't you?
From time to time.
Yeah. So what I would ask you to do is to consider three alternatives. One, make the change I asked for earlier. Secondly, I'd ask you to just say gas pumps aren't signs, and they don't count. Leave them alone. That would be my first request. Secondly, if you want to, that doesn't sit well, then we would ask you to specifically say that net pump flicks, which you've heard the presentation, you know how it works, you know that it's not a sign in the traditional manner, even though it meets some of the definitions that have been created. But look at it for the community benefits and for the things that it does and say, hey, that's okay. Pump flicks, we're not going to regulate that. And finally, and Jonathan brought this up, but John has already got the device that'll allow you, he just hasn't installed them. And this will be the device that would be on each one of these things. And you press this button and it would mute it for 5 minutes. So if you didn't want to hear it, you don't have to hear it. And that would, we hope, eliminate any concern there. So, in summary, exempt gas pumps from the definition of vending machines, exempt gas pumps from the sign ordinance, or exempt pump flicks from the sign ordinance. And I'd appreciate your consideration of that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I have a question for you or for your client while I've got you up here. And it has to do with the sound that comes. It's actually, you're actually listening, not just viewing.
That's correct.
So what's the sound profile in terms of the perimeter of the property of a pump flicks kind of installation? I mean, I've only experienced it standing in front of the pump, but I mean, I haven't gone out to the perimeter.
Yeah,
so can somebody address that for us?
I was at Seaside Shell yesterday with Mr. Price, and we were doing a site visit and familiarizing, maybe it was Monday, and we were understanding how everything worked. And we stood outside of the mini mart that's there. We stood outside of the sidewalk, and you don't hear it but as soon as you move in to the gas station or into the pump, you hear it. Now, I don't know if John has a more clear definition.
Only if you have anything more
That added
scientific.
Yeah, I didn't hear it on the perimeter of the property.
Okay, we'll take your word for it. Sounds good. All right, Mr. Cushman, followed by Mr. Henne.
Chairman House, Councilman Hotchkiss. Well, as Joe said, this is the toughest of tough times. And I'm not going to speak to the dilemma that you're posed with in further regulating small business you both know what it's like to do business now. I want to talk about gas stations because it's increasingly difficult to find a gas station. And they're small business operators. They're trying to find whatever way they can to continue their operations and to make a reasonable profit. Pump flick seems to be not to be a sign at all, but a way of sharing information with customers. As long as it's not a sign, it shouldn't be regulated by sign ordinance. I think the concept of excluding gas pumps from the sign ordinance is appropriate, and you should maintain that. My observation when I've gone to these stations is the sound doesn't go beyond the pump area, and the visual component is not a sign. You don't pay any attention to it off the property. So I think that you should let him continue with this project. He's invested a considerable amount of money in it. It does serve the public good, and it helps him keep those gas stations open. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, sir. We'll go to Mr. Hene, and then our last speaker will be Jim Caldwell.
Good afternoon. As a realtor for a lot of years, we find through studies that there's three methods of marketing property, or the three most important methods are the internet and MLS, and the third one is signage. And we're talking one sign on these properties that are not able to take a sign because they've got fences or hedges or something. And although you call it right-of-way, that is like a boulevard that's often maintained by the property owner, and one single sign is very, very important for that property owner to help us get the maximum market value for the property. I'd like to thank the staff for their support of our initiative, and this sign situation is not an unreasonable request. In a residential neighborhood, it's as long as it's placed in a safe location and one sign per property, I think that it is something that would not be injurious to the community and would be a real advantage to the property owners and us in marketing their properties. Thank you.
Mr. Hene, the open house signs, I think, are proposed to be allowed,
yes,
a limited number. But the kind of sign you were just talking about was similar to the one that was up here. That's a for sale sign, goes down into the ground, and that is proposed to be prohibited under the current. Am I understanding that correctly? Yes.
Councilmember House, they are currently, all signs are prohibited in the public right of way. So yes.
And there would be no allowance in these revisions for any signs like that to be put into the right of way in the parkway.
Correct. The only revision we're proposing with respect to signs in the public right-of-way is an allowance for up to 5 off-site open house signs, the temporary ones for the day of the open house.
Okay. Okay, then Mr. Hene, you were saying that you would prefer to have at least one, or I mean, no more than one, but that
correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we don't use 5 open house arrows unless the property is located in a real obscure location where we need those extra signs. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, last speaker is Jim Caldwell.
I'm John Hager, and you had listed my name earlier on the
John, I'm so sorry. Why don't you come right up here? My apologies. Please, I skipped right over you.
Thank you for the opportunity to
And poor
speak.
Mr. Caldwell's getting his exercise by standing up and sitting down, standing up and sitting down. Okay, yes, Mr. Hager, thank you.
Thank you, Chair House and Councilmember Hotchkiss. I'm here to address really one aspect of the pump flicks which didn't yet come before you, and that is I recently ran as a political candidate and had political announcements on there, as did some other candidates. It's been used for political speech as well, and that's important because you not only have public service messages and other things, all of this is protected by the First Amendment right to free speech, and a government can't infringe, can't abridge the right to free speech, and that's important here. This is not a set of information that is to draw people into the business, which is the valid purpose of sign restrictions. I would venture to say that there is not anyone who has ever gone into a gas station because of a pump flicks video, which you can't see from the street anyway, but that it doesn't draw people in. It communicates valuable information to people that are there, and that's what's important. And that form of speech is something that the respect that we give the First Amendment deserves to be included in this discussion.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. And now, Mr. Caldwell, as the drums roll.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Chairman House, Councilman Hotchkiss. Jim Caldwell on behalf of the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors. We did present a letter to you and to staff, and I must compliment staff on their hard work for getting where we're at right now on many of these things. But we do still have the issue regarding the sign that is placed in front of a house when it's up for sale. And as you can see by several of the pictures that we submitted, there are numerous properties in Santa Barbara whereby if we are not allowed to place a sign in the right-of-way area, there would not be a place to place a sign on these properties. In just driving up and down several streets in the city in the last few days, I would estimate it somewhere between 25 and 35% of the properties which would be excluded in this particular case. In times as it is right now, to take that many properties and say you can't have a sign and definitely hurt the saleability of the property is not something that I think is good for the individual landowners and or the city of Santa Barbara. So I would propose some form of modification whereby on some type of limited basis we would be able to put a sign on a property whereby, since it is a temporary sign, it's not something that's going to be there permanently. It's going to be there for a short period of time. Many of our properties sell in 60 to 90 days, so again, a limited time span versus something permanent. That I think we need to find a compromise between the proposed ordinance and what we're looking at as far as these signs. So I thank you for the time.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
I've got a quick question, if I could, which is realtor related, but
sure.
At one point it says in here that there won't be any signs placed on top of cars. And I know sometimes that's a popular thing for realtors to do at an open house. Can we live without that? Or maybe, and I'd like to hear your response, and then also ask staff how we can compromise here.
Seriously, that has come up, and I definitely believe that's something we could live without. I'm not even sure where that got started, but and you can justify it in some cases because you have a busy street and you would not necessarily see a sign because of a lot of parking. But personally speaking, I would tend to agree with the fact that sticking it on top of a sign is a dangerous situation because wind can blow that sign down and potentially hurt somebody. So, yeah, I would say we could definitely live without.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Very much.
Appreciate your time, gentlemen.
I'm sure we all have some more questions here for staff. I have one I just wanted to lead off with. The handheld type of signs that we see on street corners where people are twirling them around, and they've, I think they have to have taken a gymnastics class before they can do it. And where's that addressed? Where's it addressed in our ordinance?
Councilmember House, I think it could fall under the definition of a portable sign, which is any sign other than a mobile sign designated or constructed in such a manner that it can be moved or relocated without involving any structural or support changes.
Is it? I mean, it seems to me that that would be one thing that if we haven't made it crystal clear in our language, we should, and it maybe even needs to be defined. It is something that, if I look out at our sign committee people, I think they would really like to have some help with that because for enforcement purposes, if for nothing else. So maybe we could talk about that before we're done.
Mr. Chair.
Okay. Yes, please, Mr. Vincent.
In addition to the definition of a portable sign, a sign held by an individual, one in the right-of-way would be prohibited as a sign in the public right-of-way without not being excluded, such as the off-site open house signs. The other would be that it would also be an off-site sign because the sign would not be actually on the physical location. As soon as they step across the sidewalk and are standing on the sidewalk or standing a block or two away trying to direct people to a location that's other than the location where the sign is located, that becomes an off-site sign as well.
Okay, very good. And we may have some work for a future work that we aren't accomplishing today. One of them may be to work on really making that as rigorous as possible, and the other one may be to do some more study on this for sale sign situation that we have here as is being presented today, because I know I have some concerns about prohibiting them altogether or continuing that prohibition, but I don't want to see a proliferation as was talked. Mr. Hotchkiss.
Yeah, along what what you just said, Scott, would this prohibit what do I call mascot type characters, you know, Ronald McDonald pointing there or whatever? I think business people would need to know that.
I think staff could speak to how much of a problem that is, but again, a mascot that is not identifiable to a particular business doesn't do the business very much good.
Oh, right.
So in the case of Ronald McDonald and the identifying marks on Ronald McDonald, it's pretty clear where he's coming from. And I think many of the other mascots would have the similar situation. A dancing bear that doesn't have some kind of identifying mark doesn't help your business. So in general, I think we would be able to identify that these mascots that are off-site are typically identified to a particular location by their signage or their dress or some other way that would bring it back either as an off-site sign or as a sign in the right-of-way that has a particular message to a particular location.
So it'd have to be regulated but permitted, possibly? Just where do we stand here?
I think staff would say that a sign, a dancing bear in the public right-of-way is a sign with, you know, a mascot that is identifiable to a commercial business would serve as a sign in the public right-of-way or as an off-site sign.
I think we need to look at that one a little bit more carefully. All right, may I continue here?
By all means.
Regarding the real estate signs, I'd like to point out we're not just doing this for the sake of 1,000 realtors here, but that really represents we have to think of the best interests of virtually every homeowner, and probably on both sides, first as a buyer and then as a seller. And visibility is really important. I realize that the staff is put in a little of a quandary when we make an exception, but we have all sorts of exceptions and exemptions in our sign ordinance, and I think that personally speaking as a realtor and as a city council person, as a buyer and a seller, it's best to have the best visibility possible for temporary for sale signs. Maybe we could add to that, as Mr. Caldwell suggested, if feasible and possible, the sign should be located on private property, but there are instances where it can't be. Any thoughts or replies? Or
Councilmember Hotchkiss, in response to that, I think the reason that signs in the public right-of-way are prohibited is that it's the public space. It's for everyone's use and enjoyment. And so I think it really gets to, if the ordinance committee and ultimately the council wants to allow certain elements of our community or certain businesses, professions within our community to use that right-of-way for their use, then that's ultimately what you decide, and we would find a way to work that out with them. It's just...
Let me interrupt you there. That's just my point. It's not certain professions. It's everybody who owns property or wishes to own property. So, this is not, we're doing this for the plumbers or the realtors. We're doing it for everybody. I'm trying to get beyond the fact that I am myself a realtor.
Okay, well, it's up to the committee. It would be... we would have to work on language on how we would allow an exception for that particular sign in the right-of-way, if that's
Thank you.
the way you choose to go.
Thank you. May I continue?
Yeah, sure. Go down your list. That's probably the best way.
Pump Flicks, I think, presents a real challenge, and I can see how, if I were a staff person, why I would be challenged, because it's a new medium, and I'm trying to fit old rules to a new system. It is really a feature that a gas station can offer. I think it's a pretty good one too, because I'm 3 minutes sitting and pumping. I don't mind looking at something, particularly if it's constructive or informational, and if it's advertising or political thought or whatever it is. I was worried as many of you were, I think that would this be offensive sound-wise? And I'm encouraged to hear that it wouldn't be. So I think it should be excluded and not count for the signage of a gas station itself. But I'd like to hear Mr. House's thoughts on that.
Okay, is there anything else? About all the other things that are here?
I think we're okay.
Okay, let's see. Let's go down first of all, I agree with almost everything that we've been presented with today, so I won't go over all the things that I agree with in the changes. And I worry about the pizza guy that dresses up like a pizza and dances around out there. But really, if that, I don't know that it's even been an issue. But have we had complaints about any of those very few that show up?
No, in fact, I don't
time?
know where the pizza guy is.
Yeah, I haven't seen him for a long
We haven't
time.
received any complaints about dancing mascots yet.
Maybe the great big mouse ate him or something. Okay, so I do believe that on this for sale sign issue, we've been given some pictures that show situations that are really tough to identify which of the houses is the one that is for sale. And I don't know that we have a solution either way right now. I understand a concern about the public right-of-way, but there's got to be some way that people who are searching for that house, they followed the signs to get to that place, can tell which one it is. And when there's the hedge, when there's a wall or whatever, so I would, rather than decide on that today, I think that's one of the things that we might take a little bit more time with, and I'm going to suggest that at the end of this. The same thing with regards to the handheld signs, the kind that we see twirling around at corners all over the Southland, which I think are completely out of bounds in terms of Santa Barbara. We need to really get our definition tight and so that we can be good with our enforcement, and I see that as something to come out of today, and maybe we do a little bit more work on to really strengthen it. It seems like right now we have sufficient, but I don't know if it's really adequate ultimately. Let's see. And then with regards to these LCD type TVs or whatever that are on the pumps, the issue for me and the way I would define it is if you can't see it from the perimeter, if it's not if it's not something that's really visible to the public from the sidewalk, and if you can't hear it, then it doesn't matter. The public's interest is served. If they amplify the sound to a degree more than the ambient noise, if they're trying to overcome the sound of traffic and try to make sure that people, that becomes a problem. And if it becomes one of those that you see in Las Vegas that's illuminated with these, the brilliant lights and like that terrible thing we have out at Earl Warren Showgrounds. But that kind of thing, must be regulated or outright prohibited. So I make a distinction between the TV kind of built into the pump thing that we've seen here at low volumes and low intensity, and something that is really a sign attempting to attract and calling people's attention to the site and bringing them in. So it would have to be that these are on the interior, they're on the pumps, that's far enough away from the public right-of-way. They have to be, I think that there maybe should be some form of review just to know that these things are true, that they really are dim enough that you can't, they're not an annoyance and they're not that visual clutter that we talk about. And there's certainly not the noise factor, because that would be just annoying as heck for anybody in the public. So those are my comments on that. Those things may need more work, but that would be the direction I would want us to head. Let's see if there's anything else that we had here. Flags was brought up. Rules for flying flags, that was a nice suggestion with regards to patriotic, American flags and such, but I think my biggest concern would be what Mr. Cunningham had talked about with regards to flags. They're just like pole signs. I like flags, I think they're great, but they need to go through the process. And that would be my comment on that as well, that there's that process, and it would count towards the actual amount of signage that any business had. See if there are any other issues that okay, those are the comments. Staff, did you have any responses to the comments that you've heard from us or from the public? so far?
Mr. House?
Yes, please, Mr. Vincent.
If you could make some comments regarding the request regarding vending machines, the definition of vending machine and how it relates to gas pumps.
Oh, because in that definition that was on our page 7 going to page 8 in the staff report, it exempted like the air dispenser and the water dispenser. But I don't think that, it seems like that our sign, the way we, staff, would you help us with this, please? The letters and the things that are on the pumps themselves, how do we deal with that right now? I think you've helped us with that before.
Yes, Councilmember House, right now, we don't consider gas pumps vending machines. And they're not a sign, they are, a machine, a gas pump, but the signs that are on the gas pumps, if they're signs required by law to be on the pumps, they're exempt. They don't count towards the square footage. If there's accessory signage on the pumps, that would count towards the square footage if there's some sort of advertisement or something in excess of what's required by law.
Okay, so can we say that in practice in Santa Barbara, we don't consider them as vending machines, so they don't fit within the definition that was given to us earlier of vending machines? We just aren't doing that.
Correct. That hasn't been our practice.
Okay. I think that might just be
Mr.
enough,
Chair,
don't you think?
I think staff understands and we understand how the issue of we're not looking to prohibit mechanical dispensers of gasoline from EPV.
Right.
Whether there's advertising and what kind of advertising should be on those devices, I think can be dealt with as a separate question. But the key thing I believe Mr. Fell is looking at is not precluding a mechanical device that dispenses gasoline because it can be thrown into the definition of vending machine, which would have been an unintended consequence.
Do you have any suggestions on how we haven't had that come up so far, but
we can come up with an exclusion to the definition of vending machine that allows gas pumps to continue.
Okay, that's good. And I think, addressing this letter that we received from the Historic Landmarks Commission, I really do believe that where we want to go with this is the actual effect on the public. If there's only one gas station, I think, in EPV, the one on the corner of Chapala and Carrillo Street, I think, right? In any case, is there another one on State Street in EPV? Oh, up at Valerio. Is that EPV? Okay, well, anyway, so there's two. So if there's no sound at the edge of the property and you can't really, it's not drawing your attention to it, I think the public's interest is served. So I'm just giving you my comments on that. And I know that HLC had a concern, certainly from visual clutter and from sound. So that was the amplified sound issue. I'm falling on the side of what the actual impact is to people on the edge of the property. And Mr.
Do we need a motion at this point?
We're right about at that point.
Okay.
Well, you're the only one here.
Okay.
So.
I make a motion that we pass this with the exceptions that you've noted, which would accept the signs, that so-called pump flick signs, from review, and that we go back and, I guess revisit is the right term, the signage placement for temporary for sale signs for homes.
And I will second that with a question about this about the review. For me, it is important that they demonstrate that they're meeting these two criteria. One is that, and I think it's essential that from the street, it's not a glaring attraction. Somebody has to make that call, and that it's not a audible nuisance at the street. So there's some level of staff review or some level of review that would actually make that call in the process. Yes, please, Ms. Brooke.
Yes, and thank you, Councilmember House. I was going to ask to clarify. Our understanding was, I think, the way the committee is going is that to add video display to the definition of a sign, but find a way through exceptions to not make those prohibited, but instead make them subject to review and sign regulations like all other signs that aren't exempt or prohibited.
Is that going to add a cost to the people involved? I mean, basically, it's a walk-by, right?
To go through sign review does require a fee and a permit from the Building and Safety Division.
Well, I prefer that it was excluded from that, frankly. I just don't think we need to add that.
Is there a way to address this issue in term that manages to get in between the two of us here on this one, because I really think we need to find some way to effectively avoid a public nuisance problem with this, and the sound is critically important in that.
Right, but we've got proof already, and maybe we need to go out and experience it, but at least by the proponents, that the fears that you and I have are met. So rather than require that to be done over and over again, so long as those signs match what's existing, we're fine. If down the line we find that it isn't, then we should review this again.
Okay, any other comments from staff?
So an option is to make these video display signs, specifically the pump flicks, they could be exempt from the sign regulations, which would mean that we would not see them, we would not review them, they would just be allowed without a permit or...
That's my preference, and then respond if, in fact, we find that that's not the case.
So, Mr. Vincent?
I'm a little hesitant to have a black or white recommendation to this point. I would like to recommend to the committee the following, that you give staff the direction to investigate a provision that would allow for video as well as audio associated with gas pumps, but that staff prepare provisions for the ordinance consistent with your direction today, or to come back to either the ordinance or present to the council, if you're forwarding this ordinance to the council, with an explanation as to why staff does not recommend including such an allowance at this point. The reason I'm hesitant is this. There may be unintended consequences to having video displays in gas pumps and how it plays out with the rest of our sign ordinance. The other is simply a matter of, I don't know if there is a consistency in the design of gas stations such that all gas stations, just by the fact that it's on a gas pump, will not be heard at the right-of-way. In other words, and so speaking to Councilmember Hotchkiss's concern of wanting to have basically a ministerial permit, to anything that would require a case-by-case analysis of whether or not that pump can be heard at the right-of-way is going to require a case-by-case analysis. That requires a permit. That requires some kind of level of discretionary review that's more than just a walk-through permit as you described. So my recommendation to the committee to have an up or down vote right now and forward this to the council would be to have staff investigate this and put provisions into the draft ordinance if we can get there, or explain to the council why we couldn't get there with a recommendation.
Okay, well, I think we're both going in the same direction, and so I think we can go with that, right? Okay, so we'll include that as part of the motion. Is there anything else to add? Okay, great. All those in favor? Aye. And opposed? Okay.